everybody. Hey, if we haven't met yet, my name is Doug. I'm one of the pastors here at Venture Missionary Church. And this morning, we're continuing a series that we started a few weeks ago called The Best Yes, How to Make Wise Decisions. And if you were brave enough to come to church during the heat wave, you might just actually remember that we've been talking about this over the past few weeks. And specifically, we've been talking about the fact that every day you and I face literally hundreds of decisions. And a lot of those decisions, you know, they're sort of mundane decisions, right? Things like what to eat for breakfast and what color socks to wear and what kind of toothpaste to buy and like all of those kinds of decisions. But the reality is that every day you and I face potentially life-changing, trajectory-shaping kinds of decisions as well. Sometimes without even knowing it, and sometimes they are these weighty decisions that we're facing and we're agonizing over and we're not sure what to do and what to say yes to and what to say no to. And so a few weeks ago when we started this series, we talked about the fact that wise decisions start with intimacy and obedience. We looked at a passage in Luke chapter 6 where Jesus says, those who come to me and hear my words and put them into practice. And so we extrapolated from that idea or that passage, this idea that first we have to come to Jesus to be in this intimate relationship with Jesus and listen to his words and actually put his words into practice, that wisdom and wise decisions start from a place of intimacy and obedience. And then 2 weeks ago, we talked about the fact that wise decisions require us to pray, prioritize, pre-decide, and prune. Now, if you were here that week, the only thing you remember is that week was ridiculously hot, and you spent the whole service going like this. That's probably all you remember from that week. But I'll remind you, we talked about this passage in Mark chapter 1, where Jesus had done ministry all day in this town, and then the next morning woke up early and went off to pray. His disciples, on behalf of the crowd of people, went to go find Jesus to bring him back so he could do more ministry and teach more and heal more. And Jesus said, no, we're actually not going back. We're actually going to move on because this is why God has called me to go and preach the gospel to all these different places. And so Jesus actually said no to a huge group of people that wanted him to say yes. And Jesus actually said no. He prioritized, he pre-decided, and then he was able to prune out the things that didn't belong in order to say yes to the things that did belong. Now, we looked at that story, and so we realized that, yeah, we like Jesus, we can't say yes to everything. There's too many opportunities, too many obligations, too many expectations, too many things presented to us for us to say yes to everything. And so we have to be able to say no to some things. But then last week, Marcy talked to us about the fact that we also can't say no to everything either. That we have to be willing to serve sacrificially, right? That while at the one hand we can't say yes to every opportunity that comes our way, we also can't just bury ourselves and lock ourselves away in our house and say no to every opportunity either. We can't say no to every opportunity to give. We can't say no to every opportunity to serve. We can't say yes to all of them. But again, on the other side, we can't say no to every opportunity that comes our way. And this morning, we're going to continue this series on making wise decisions by talking about the fact that wise decisions require us to admit our limits and ask for help. To admit our limits and to ask for help, which for some of us is incredibly difficult to do. In fact, you might be sitting with someone, nudging someone right now saying, oh my gosh, this is totally for you, right? Because we have a hard time acknowledging, admitting our limits and asking for real help. So in order to do that, we're going to look at a passage of scripture found in Exodus chapter 18. So if you want to pre-turn there, you can. That's where we're going to be this morning is Exodus 18. And we'll read that in just a moment. But I want to explain to you, for me, why this passage in Exodus chapter 18 is so significant. This passage had a profound impact on my life about 2.5 years ago. And I want to explain. It's actually where I picked up this piece of wood. So I'm going to connect the dots between this random piece of wood that I carried up here with me and this passage in Exodus chapter 18. So About 4 years ago, I had the privilege of stepping into this role as the pastor of Venture Missionary Church. Prior to that, I had had the privilege of serving here at Venture Missionary Church as a student ministries pastor for a number of years and loved every minute of that. And through a series of events that took place here, I stepped into the role as the pastor. I'd never pastored a church before. And so, I figured, well, a lot of the skills and abilities that I developed in retail management or in coaching or in youth ministry or other forms of ministry that I had served in probably will translate pretty well. And so I'll probably be able to kind of figure this out as I go a little bit. And there's a lot of people here in our church that had a lot more faith in me than I had in myself. And so I stepped into this role, and very early on, I began to take on more responsibility than probably I was capable of handling. Now, some of you have done this, whether you're a student and you took too many classes, whether you're, at work, you took on too many projects or too many responsibilities, whether you're a parent and you're like, I had too many kids, or, whatever the situation is, right? We've all kind of felt ourselves like, yeah, I think I kind of took on too much, right? We've all had that moment where we go, oh my gosh, did I bite off more than I can chew, right? We've all had that. And that was very much me in the first year or two of my role, of my time in this role. I felt like, and again, this was a lot of me. Some of it was projected on me. There was an expectation. Part of it was me just kind of taking this on myself. I felt like I had to make every decision. Like every decision that needed to be made, I had to weigh in on. And so everyone felt like they had to bring every decision to me to see what my input was and my perspective and my thoughts were. And so I felt like I had to make every decision, that I had to be at every meeting or lead every meeting or be in every meeting on every subject and every topic. And listen, if you're a part of Venture Missionary Church, maybe you feel like, well, isn't it just like a Sunday morning service? Like, how hard is that? But some of you know that like Venture Missionary Church has a lot of ministry that goes on all around the world, all around our community that we're involved in. We have a large school and a preschool, a large staff, lots of different ministries. And so there's a lot going on. And I began to shoulder all of this responsibility. Like I had to solve all the problems. I had to run all the meetings. I had to supervise all the staff. I had to preach all the sermons on Sunday morning. I had to be at every event. If there was an event happening, didn't matter if I was directly involved or not, I needed to at least be there to like smile and shake hands and give hugs and say hi to everybody. So I was out like every night. I was working 70, 80 more hours a week. It was just too much. I had to visit everybody that was in the hospital, call everybody who was sick, officiate every wedding, every funeral. Like I just took on this load. And I went on this, so this is where this piece of wood comes in. I got invited to a prayer retreat that was being hosted by one of the guys in our denomination. It was for some local pastors. In fact, Pastor Scott, who I didn't really know that well at the time, went on this as well. We actually went together. We drove together. And I'll never forget, the second day, I'm at this prayer retreat up at Lake Hughes at this retreat center, and we were given this assignment. After breakfast, the guy leading this retreat said, I want you to spend the rest of the morning. Breakfast is over at like 8:30 or whatever. Spend the rest of the morning until lunchtime at 12:30. So it's 4 hours in silence and solitude. Just want you to pray and find a quiet place to pray. Now, I don't know about you. Some of you probably have no problem praying for 4 hours. Others of you perhaps are a bit more like me, where 5 minutes in and your mind is already wandering, right? And it's like a dog off a leash and you've got to like rein it back in, right? Now, over time, we begin to become better and better about this, actually finding joy in extended periods of prayer and learning to sort of rein in all of those thoughts. But at that point, my mind was on so many different things. And so I sat there and tried to pray. I knelt by the bed and tried to pray. I sat in the chair and tried to pray. And my mind was just all over the place. And so I'm like, I've got to go somewhere. I've got to walk somewhere. And so I walked outside. It was in January of 2020. I walked outside. It was kind of cold. So I'm like, I'm going to walk some of the hills and just go on these trails. And so I began to walk these trails, and I found this place all alone, kind of up at this peak, and I had my Bible, and I just sat down, and I just began to read. And the Lord brought me to this passage in Exodus chapter 18. When I say the Lord brought me, I don't mean like there was wind and it blew and it flipped the pages and it popped open and there was a light that shone. It wasn't like that. I just, kind of had begun reading and found myself in that passage. And this passage just, the Spirit of God just began to speak to me through this passage and reveal some things that connected exactly to my felt experience. I was carrying all of these burdens and I read this passage. I'm like, oh my gosh, God, thank you. And just began to praise and worship. And that moment was so significant that I looked around and I found this, like I said, I found this piece of wood. I don't even know what kind of wood it is. I just picked it up and I'm like, this is going to be a memorial of the thing that God did in my life. And so I brought it home. It sits up on a shelf in my office and it reminds me of this moment and this passage. So I'm going to share this passage with you. Exodus chapter 18. We're going to turn there together. We're going to start in verse 5. And as we begin, let me just remind you, if you're not familiar with the Bible or you're new to the Bible, that this is taking place right on the heels of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, into the desert, eventually into the Promised Land. They're about 2 months into their journey. And Moses' father-in-law pops up. So this is verse 5. It says this: Jethro, who was Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' sons and wife, came to him in the wilderness, where he was camped near the mountain of God. He's with all the other Israelites that have just exited Egypt. Jethro had sent word to Moses saying, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. Let me just pause there for just a sec, okay? We're going to pick up the passage. We're going to read all the way through verse 24, but I'm going to interrupt it a couple of times to make sure that some of this is making sense. Okay, Jethro, who in the world is this? Let me tell you really quick, for all you Bible nerds like me out there, they're like, oh, tell me more about Jethro. Some of you are like, I don't care. It's a weird name. Trust me, it's a cool story. Okay, so Jethro, what we learn about Jethro in verse 1 of chapter 18 is that he is a Midianite. He's Moses' father-in-law. He's the father of Moses' wife, Zipporah, but he's also a Midianite priest, which means that he was a descendant of a guy named Midian. Now, I'm not sure how many of you could tell me who Midian is, but I'll tell you who Midian is or who he was in the Bible. He's actually one of Abraham's sons. Abraham's wife, Sarah, passed away. He took a second wife named Keturah, and with Keturah, he had a series of children, one of whom was a young man or a man named Midian. You can read about this in Genesis 25. Now, if you know the story of Moses, you may remember that Moses was an Israelite child born in Egypt during a time that the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. And through God's providence, Moses ended up getting adopted by Pharaoh's daughter and raised in the Pharaoh's palace. But when he grew up, he began to recognize his ethnic identity as an Israelite. He began to see all of his Israelite sisters and brothers being mistreated and enslaved. And so something began to well up on the inside of him. One day he saw an Egyptian slave master beating an Israelite slave, and he'd had enough. And so he stood up for the slave, and he actually ended up killing the slave master, a crime that would have been punishable by death. And so he ended up fleeing the country of Egypt, and he went to, does anyone remember where he went? He went to Midian. So this is kind of the connection here where we meet a guy named Jethro, who's the priest of Midian. Moses ends up fleeing, lands in a place called Midian. Almost immediately, he runs into 7 sisters who are trying to water their father's flocks, but they're being harassed by a group of shepherds. Moses once again stands up for these women to protect them against these harassing shepherds. And the 7 sisters go back to tell their father about this man that protected them, and their father's name was Jethro. He's also called Ruel, which means friend of God in this story. You can read about this in Exodus chapter 2. And so these women go back, these sisters go back and tell Jethro. Jethro sends word to Moses, hey, we don't know who you are. You're a stranger in this country. Come in and have dinner at our house. I want to thank you. And over time, Moses ends up marrying Jethro's daughter, Zipporah. And he ends up living with Jethro and his wife, Zipporah, in Midian for a long time. In fact, if you know the story of Exodus 3, where Moses encounters the burning bush, that happens in Midian while he was tending his father-in-law Jethro's flocks. Okay? So, now, God sends Moses, after this encounter at the burning bush, if you know the story, God sends Moses back to Egypt in order to lead the people out of Egypt. So Moses goes and talks to Pharaoh, and if you know the story, over a period of time and 10 plagues, eventually Pharaoh says, take the Israelites and go, get out of here. And Moses leads them through the Red Sea out into the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. This is sort of the great escape out of Egypt. So we fast forward now. This is where we pick up the story in Exodus 18. We fast forward to a couple of months after the Israelites have escaped into the wilderness. They're in the desert on their way to Mount Sinai, and Jethro, his father-in-law, sends word to Moses, I'm coming to visit, and I'm bringing your wife, and I'm bringing your children with me. So we go back to Exodus 18. We're going to pick it up in verse 7, where Moses greets his father-in-law, probably in the same way that you greet your in-laws. Verse 7, so Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. Well, maybe you'd get along better with your in-laws if you did that. Anyway, side note. Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they had met along the way and how the Lord had saved them. Jethro hears all this in verse 9, and he's delighted to hear about all the good things that the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hands of the Egyptians. He said, praise to the Lord who rescued you from the hands of the Egyptians and Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. Now let me stop there for just a sec, because this is where the story is going to get interesting. Right now we're kind of like, okay, what's the big deal? What's happening here? This is where it gets interesting, because the next morning, after this meal that Moses' father-in-law and Aaron and all the elders of Israel have together, the next morning Moses woke up and does what many of us do in the morning. He went off to work. And guess who goes with him? His father-in-law, Jethro. Nothing like a good old-fashioned bring your father-in-law to work to bring the family together, right? So father-in-law goes with Moses to work. He's watching Moses. He's sort of staring over Moses' shoulder the whole day, watching Moses at his job. Can you just imagine that, right? So anyway, this is what happens. So we pick it up in verse 13. The next day, Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people. Remember, he's got a camp of like 1 million Israelites, and so he takes his seat as a judge for all the people. And they stood around him from morning until evening. So all day Moses is judging among the people. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, what is this you are doing for all the people? Like, why do you alone, you're the only one, why do you alone sit as judge while all the people stand around you from morning until evening? So Moses explains, well, father-in-law, let me explain to you what you don't understand. See, because the people come to me to seek God's will. See, whenever they have a dispute, it's brought to me, kind of like Judge Judy, and I decide between the parties, and I inform them of God's decrees and instructions. Okay, now, to me, this sounds like a perfectly reasonable explanation. Like, I read that, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, it's 1 million people. They have disputes, right? And they need to know what they're supposed to do. How does God's law, impact, or what does God want them to do? And so they're asking Moses, and Moses is judging among the people. But Jethro has a different opinion about whether or not this is a good thing. To Moses, it's kind of like, I don't know, they need a judge. I'm the only one capable of serving as the judge, so I just show up every morning and I do it, and the people all stand around me. But listen to what Jethro says in verse 17. This is his father-in-law. Moses' father-in-law replied, what you are doing is not good. Now, I love that. I want to pause there for just a second on that. Okay, again, this is, his father-in-law, right? I mean, I can imagine, like, his father-in-law shows up to work. He's watching him work all day, and Moses is probably thinking to himself, look at me. I'm so important. All these people are watching me, right? All these people are coming to me. I'm the one with the answers. I'm the one that all the people are coming to. Like, look at how important I am. Look at how valuable I am. My father-in-law is watching. He must be so proud. And then when they finally get alone and he's waiting for Jethro to say, Moses, I'm so proud of you. Look at all that you've accomplished. Look at all these people that you're in charge of. Wow, my daughter really married up. I just could not be more proud. Is that what he says? No, he says, Moses, what you are doing is no good. What? What do you mean it's no good? Do you see how important I am? Do you see how valuable I am to the people? And Jethro says, what you are doing is not good. And then he begins to explain. And I want to read verse 18, and then I'm going to pause for just one more moment, and then we'll read the rest of the passage. Jethro begins to explain in verse 18. He says, listen, you and the people who come to you, listen, you're only going to wear yourselves out. See, the work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Let me pause there. We're going to come back and we're going to read the rest of the passage. But let me just speak to you as your pastor for a moment. Because some of you in this room know exactly what Jethro is talking about. You know exactly what it feels like to feel worn out. To feel like the burdens of the responsibilities that you carry are just too heavy. Maybe they weren't at first, but now at this point, it just feels like the burdens that you carry are too heavy. So some of you in this room know exactly what it feels like to have so many expectations, so many obligations, so many commitments, so many people coming to you that need something from you, so many tasks to accomplish in a day, so many demands, so many deadlines to meet. You know exactly what Jethro is talking about when he tells his son-in-law, Moses, this is too much for you. You're going to wear yourself out. And at the same time, you're going to frustrate the people because you can't meet all of their demands and all of their expectations. This is not good. Some of you, as you sit here today, are in that exact same position. You're overwhelmed. You're overworked. You're stressed out. You're burnt out, or you're in danger of becoming burnt out if something doesn't change. And that's exactly what Jethro recognized in Moses. And so Jethro leaned in and he gave Moses some advice. And he gave him some practical advice that I want to read to you. He says this in verse 19. He says, listen to me and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Okay, so he's the one. You're not it, Moses. God is the one. Teach them his decrees and instructions and show them the way they are to live and how they are to behave. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials. They can be over thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens. Have them serve. So delegate the responsibilities. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times. But you can still have them bring every difficult case to you, but the simple cases, they can decide for themselves. That will make this is important, that will make your load lighter, because they will share it with you. If you do this and God so commands, in other words, like I'm giving you advice, but take it to the Lord and ask him to confirm it, well, then you will be able to stand the strain and the people will go home satisfied. In other words, you'll be better off and they'll be better off too. Verse 24, Moses listened to his father-in-law. There's a good lesson there. Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. So let's stop there. So the thing is, Moses was trying to do the right thing, right? This isn't a story about Moses being disobedient or like doing something sinful or doing something wrong, and God had to bring him some correction because he was sinning against the Lord. That's not what this story is. He was trying to work hard. Like he was trying to serve the people. He was trying to take the responsibility that he'd been given and be responsible with it. He was trying to be a good leader. He was trying to meet the legitimate needs of the people that he was responsible for. Like there was nothing wrong with that impulse of wanting to serve and lead and care and take care of the people that had been entrusted to him. But just like Lisa Turkhurst says in her book, The Best Yes, she writes this: if the activity we are involved in is in line with God's will, but our approach to that activity isn't, we will only overdraw ourselves and bankrupt that part of our lives. She writes, see, a good approach to something requires enough resources to handle the demands of that activity. And then she says this: you won't ever be able to keep up with unrealistic. That's so good. You won't ever be able to keep up with unrealistic. But that doesn't stop some of us from trying, does it? Some of us are just bent that way. In fact, the harder the task, the more daunting the task, the more we feel emboldened and empowered to charge the hill. And so we look at things that other people see as unrealistic, and we roll up our sleeves and we go, let's get at it, let's try it, let's go for it. And there's a beautiful impulse there, but there's also a very dangerous impulse in that as well, which is what Moses fell into. See, you can't keep up with unrealistic. And for many of us, that's exactly what this looks like. Unrealistic for us, trying to keep up with unrealistic, looks like this. And let me explain what I mean. We start off with a manageable load of expectations, right? Manageable load of expectations. You know, we got our job. Maybe we've got some family, that we're responsible for, right? We've got a home that we need to take care of, and things around the home that we've got to make sure that we're taking care of, right? We got friends, and those friends have needs, and so we want to make sure that we're, meeting those friends' needs and available for coffee and available to have a beer and available to meet and have conversation. And so we try to meet, those needs. And, the church, I'm a part of a church family, and so I want to serve, I want to be a part, and so I take on some responsibilities, and I serve somewhere, and I'm involved somewhere. And yes, I have financial needs, but I also want to give to the ministry of the church, and so I take some of that on as well. And, pretty soon I'm wearing this backpack, and this backpack is pretty full. And it's good stuff. It's the right stuff. It's the stuff that all of us probably ought to have in our backpacks. And so we're carrying this backpack. But along the way, we start picking up more and more responsibilities and commitments, more demands and more expectations, more people coming to us and saying, hey, can you meet? Hey, can we talk? Hey, I need this, and so there's more and more. And along the way, we start picking up more responsibilities and more commitments. More expectations, more demands. Like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, we start saying yes to more and more things, and which isn't necessarily a bad thing until that load begins to get a little too heavy. And we find ourselves sort of waking up in the morning with a knot in the pit of our stomach because of all the stuff that's going to be coming at us that day, all the stuff that we didn't get to yesterday or the week before, all the people that are going to be texting us, hey, how come you didn't text me back? Hey, how come you didn't email me back? What are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about that? Right? And we're carrying this load, and we go and we go and we go, and we still feel 10 steps behind, and these responsibilities and these burdens that we've taken on just begin to become too much. And we find ourselves carrying around, I can't even get it on, and we carry this backpack of responsibilities and expectations that become this burden, and this burden becomes heavier and heavier and heavier. And then by the time we do try to delegate, by the time we try to hand some things off or say no to more things, by the time we find ourselves doing that, it's too late. Like, this backpack is already too heavy. We've already got too much. And besides, no one else can do it the way that we do it. And so we hold on to these things because no one else can really do it as well as we can do it. And if I give it to them, they're going to mess it up, and it's going to make more work. And so I'm just going to hold on to it. And we're carrying this burden in this backpack, and it's getting heavier and heavier. And we keep trying to rescue everyone. And we keep trying to be there for everyone because we don't want to let anyone down. We don't want to disappoint anyone. So we keep putting more and more stuff in our backpack. And so we pick up another commitment and another obligation, and another responsibility, and another client, and another pet, and another purchase, and another project, and another unrealistic expectation, and then inevitably, we get to the point where our backpack is too full. I mean, it's just too full. It's too heavy, and now it's impossible for us to carry it any further, right? And by this time, we're usually bitter. We're usually resentful because no one else is carrying the load that I'm carrying, and I've got all of this weight, and how come nobody else, and nobody else is wanting to help, and nobody else carries the weight and so we find ourselves feeling bitter and resentful because it feels like no one else is doing the work that we're doing, no one else is carrying the weight that we're carrying. We're the ones that put all the stuff in the backpack, and then finally, in a moment of frustration and anger and resentment and exhaustion, right? We just find ourselves throwing the backpack off and dumping all of those things onto the ground and all over the people around us. Does this sound familiar? No, just me? Okay. It should, because we've all done it or we've all seen someone else. Why do we do this to ourselves? There's probably all sorts of reasons. I wrote some of them down. You might hear yourself in some of these or hear someone sitting next to you in one of these. Pride. We don't want to admit that we can't. We want to prove something to someone. Sometimes we're trying to prove something to someone that isn't even in our lives anymore. They passed away 15 years ago, and we're still trying to prove that we can. For some of us, it's how we were raised. I mean, you just do it. You just suck it up. There's this hyper-individualism in the American culture that we just sort of absorb. It's this sort of John Wayne, I can do it all by myself and I don't need anyone else kind of mentality. It's a lack of trust in others. It's the idea that no one else can do it the way that I do it, which very well may be true. Of course, you'll never know. An overactive sense of responsibility. No, this is mine. I need to carry it. Some of us, we just need to be needed. Some of it's actually, it's a codependency. It's actually a selfishness. I need to be needed. I need you to need me. So I'm going to create dependence so that you need me, and that makes me feel good about myself. But eventually those needs become too much, and I drop the backpack, and I'm frustrated, and it wasn't even anyone else's fault. It was my fault. Some of us, we just want the credit. We just want to be recognized. Oh my gosh, look at how much you do. Look at how strong. Look at how hard you work. Look at how, oh my God. It's like this badge of honor. Our busyness becomes a badge of honor. Some of us, we just have this Messiah complex. We just have to rescue everyone and everything. We're the ones. And I love that Jethro said to Moses, no, point them to God first. Like, you're not the Messiah, Moses. For some of us, it's our source of self-worth. This is especially common probably in men and women, probably in fathers and mothers, but in different ways. At work, we take on all this responsibility, and that's where I get my sense of self-worth. In the home, I take on all the needs, and I do everything for the kids and everything, and that's where my sense of self-worth comes from. That's my identity as a mom, as a dad, as a husband, as a father, as a provider, as a whatever. For some of us, it's guilt. It's almost like we're beating ourselves over the back for something we didn't do or something we wish we would have done or something we should have done. And so now we've got to spend the rest of our lives trying to make up for that. And so we're driven along by guilt. And sometimes it's just because we're in a legitimate season or a role where we have a significant amount of responsibilities that we literally just can't delegate. There are certain things as a mom you can't just give away to anyone. There are certain things at work that you probably can't just give away to anyone. You might be an only child, and your mom is sick or your parents are aging, and it's like there really isn't anyone else. So I get there are legitimate seasons where there are things that we just can't delegate. But I know that often many of us just like to be the person, to be known as the person who can just get things done. The person that's dependable and reliable, that if no one else can do it, I know that person can. We like to be that person. We like to be the person with the 100-gallon tank and the nonstop energy. And I know because I are one. I want to prove myself. I personally, I do this. I want people to like me. I want people to appreciate me. I want people to think I'm doing a good job. I want to be there for everyone. I don't want to let anyone down. I hate it when I let people down. I hate it when someone needs me or needed a call or needed a meeting and I couldn't and there's just no way. I hate that feeling. But I've discovered the exact same thing that every one of us in this room have discovered. It's not possible. Like, it's not possible to not let anyone down. It's not possible to not let things fall. It's not possible to do everything that everyone expects for us to be able to do. That is not possible because we all have limits. We all have a capacity. And it doesn't matter if you've got a 50-gallon tank or a 100-gallon tank. At the end of the day, every single one of us has a capacity. And it doesn't matter how, again, what the size of your tank is. Every one of us is like a cup that has a capacity. And we can hold a lot. And we might be able to hold more than most people. And we might be able to hold more than anyone else we know, more responsibility, more obligations, more commitments, more expectations, more. But at some point, we reach our capacity. And at that point, everything else that gets poured in is ultimately, inevitably going to end up on the floor. Like, that's just reality. And it's undeniable. In fact, I love this quote. I want to read it to you. It's from Jenny Allen. She says this: capacity, you have one. So stop apologizing for that, she says. It's put there so that you will rest and ask for help. So you have to choose to live with both rest and a team. Because we were built to need rest and to need God and to need each other. The original sin, this is so good, was people trying to act and be like God. So let's be human. When will you rest this week? She asks. When will you ask for help? So how do we do this? How do we resolve this tension? How do we get off this merry-go-round? Do we just follow exactly what Jethro told Moses? Well, I don't know that it's as simple as just applying that principle to every situation in our life. But I do think that it begins with doing what Moses was forced to do, and that is this. We need to admit our limits and ask for help. We have to admit that we have a capacity, that we actually do have limits. And sometimes we need to announce that broadly and brightly and loudly so that everyone in our lives actually hears us say it and then live it out. I have a limit. I have a capacity. And the idea is that we don't wait until the backpack is so ridiculously full that it drops before we admit that. The idea is that we would admit that before it becomes a life and death situation. But we have to admit that we have limits. We have to learn to ask for help. And some of us, those are the hardest words we have to utter, right? I need help. I can't do this. I'm not sure what to do next. I need help. Pastor Brian next week is going to talk to us about the importance of having people in our lives and in our corners that can speak into those moments. But we have to be willing to admit I am at the end, or I am getting close and I need help. That's what Moses did. When he followed the advice of his father-in-law Jethro and he stopped trying to do it all himself, and when Moses did this, listen, it was better for everybody. Like, it wasn't just about Moses. That was the thing that stood out to me about this passage when I first read it. It wasn't just self-preservation. Jethro says, listen, this is actually going to be better for you and the people. See, if you keep doing it the old way, not only are you going to wear out, but the people are going to be frustrated. It's actually not good for them either. And so when Moses did this, when finally Moses acknowledged that he had a limit, when he admitted that he had a limit and he asked for help, it was actually good for him because it alleviated the strain and the pressure that he was carrying. It was better, listen, for the people that Moses delegated to. It was actually good for them. He handed off responsibility to, in this case, it was men, but regardless of whether it's men or women or children or adults, he handed those responsibilities off, and it was actually better for them. These were men in this story, men who actually had capacity, who had the ability to help. They had leadership. They had discerning abilities, but they weren't being used. They weren't being utilized. But the moment that Moses said, okay, I'm going to admit that I need help, I'm going to ask for help, it allowed all of these other men in the story to be able to step up and use their gifts instead of just waiting in the corner being unnecessary and irrelevant and redundant. But so often we shoulder the responsibility, and meanwhile there's all these men and women and beautiful people around us that would love to help, that would love to support, that would love to be a part, but we're too busy saying, no, I'm good, I'm fine, I've got it. It's one of the reasons that we have just an incredible staff here of men and women who actually carry not just responsibility, but authority. They have the authority to make real decisions about where our church goes and what our church does. It's one of the reasons I don't preach every Sunday either. I don't need to be the guy that preaches every Sunday. We got incredible preachers on our team. So why would we not utilize them? I don't have to be the only one. I want to equip and empower the people around me, and I want to encourage you to do the same. But not only was it better for Moses, not only was it better for the people he empowered, it was better for the people that he served. They were served better when authority and responsibility had been handed off to people because Moses admitted he had a limit and he asked for help. At the beginning of the meeting, or at the beginning of this message, I shared about that time in my life when I just had shouldered too much. I shared about that moment where the Holy Spirit just brought me to this passage, gave me this random little piece of wood, and reminded me of this. And that day at the retreat center, the Holy Spirit got my attention. And I was confronted by these words that Jethro spoke. What you are doing is not good. You are only going to wear yourself out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. So let me ask you this morning, as you listen to this message and we wrap it up, where do you hear the voice of the Lord speaking into your heart and saying to you, what you are doing, it's not good. You're going to wear yourself out. This work, it's too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. So friends, are you ready to admit your limits? First to God. God, I've been trying to do this alone. I haven't even invited you in. I haven't even acknowledged. When are you going to admit your limits to God? Or to your husband if you have one, or your wife if you have one, or to your parents, or even to your kids. Well, no, we have to pretend that everything is. No, you don't. The kids already know. When are you going to actually admit it? When are you going to admit your limits to your boss or to your employees or to your coworkers? Well, I don't care. Okay. But there's something powerful about actually confessing and admitting your limits, regardless of the people you're admitting to are ready to help you or not. It's important that we actually acknowledge it. When are you going to be willing to admit your limits to your friends who rely on you that maybe you can't keep meeting with as often as they want to? Or when are you going to admit your limits to your small group? Guys, in my small group, can I just confess to you? Can I just let you know what I'm feeling? Or your church family? Are you ready to ask for help? From God, from your husband, from your wife, from your parents, from your kids, from your boss, employees, coworkers, friends, your small group, your church family. Are you ready to say the words, I need help. I can't do this. I can't keep up this pace. I can't keep juggling these balls and carrying this backpack. I can't keep meeting all the expectations and demands. I can't keep carrying all these burdens. Friends, I have good news for you, and this is where I want to close this morning. We serve a God who sees us in those moments, who cares for us in those moments, who wants to come alongside of us, who wants us to come to him and admit our limits and ask him for help. In fact, there's this beautiful passage that I read this Monday with our staff when we gathered together to pray. It's in Psalm 68, verse 19. And it says this, praise be to the Lord, to God our Savior, who daily bears our burdens. We serve a God who daily is willing to help us bear our burdens. And then there's this passage in Matthew chapter 11 that I want to read as we close. Matthew chapter 11, this passage, I actually read it on Tuesday in our staff prayer time, and we read it again on Thursday because it was still relevant. It's the last text that I sent to a friend of mine who died from cancer on Friday night. And this is the last text I sent her was this passage, Matthew chapter 11, verses 28, 29, and 30. And in it, Jesus says this, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. He says, come to me. Coming to him is an acknowledgement. I have limits and I need help. Jesus, I'm coming to you. He says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. He says, take my yoke. My teachings, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. He says, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Friends, it's the Spirit of the Lord, Jesus saying to you this morning, come to me. Bring your burdens to me. Bring your hurried pace and your hurried life and your hurried thoughts and bring them to me. Come to me with all the things that you're carrying in your backpack. And let me help you. He's saying, admit your limits. Ask me for help. Friends, if you're able, I'm going to invite you to stand to your feet with me this morning, and I'm going to pray. And if you're here this morning, and your backpack's a little too full. Maybe it's a lot too full. If your burdens are too heavy and they're more than you can handle, this is what I'm going to invite everyone to do. I'm going to ask everybody in the room, if you would, just to close your eyes. Whether you're standing or sitting, just close your eyes. And if you're here this morning and you feel like your burdens are too heavy and your backpack is more than you can handle, I'm going to ask you, if you would, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. Nobody else is looking around. Just raise your hand like, oh man, yeah, I'm carrying some burdens and it's too much. I'm just asking you to raise your hand. There's going to be people all around the room that are raising their hands. So don't feel like you're going to be the only one. But just raise your hand up real high because I want to know who I'm praying for. I want to pray for those who have their hands raised up. So just raise your hand up. Okay. Lots of people all around the room. You can go and put your hands down. I just want to pray for you. Lord Jesus, Thank you that we can come to you when we are burdened and heavy laden. And you say that you'll give us rest, that in you we'll find rest for our souls. Lord, would you teach us, all of us in this room, whether we are currently overburdened, or maybe we've got some burdens, but we're okay. We can kind of handle it right now. Maybe we don't have too much, and we're like, yeah, we could probably take on some burdens. Lord, regardless of where we are in that continuum, I pray that we would learn to admit to you and to others that we actually do have a limit, that we actually do have a capacity. In fact, I pray that today we would find someone that we could actually confess that to, that we would come to you and say, God, I can't. I am at my limit. And that also, Lord, that we would learn to ask for help. That those of us that just have a hard time admitting and asking for help, Lord, that you would bring us to a place of humility and acknowledgement where we can say, yeah, I can't do it all. I've acted like I can. I pretended like I can. For all these years, I've made it seem like I can, but I can't. Lord, would you help us to learn to admit that we've got limits and learn to ask for help? Thank you that we can come to you and find the rest that we need. For any one of us in this room, Lord, that have not ever placed our trust and our faith in you, I pray that this morning would be the day that they begin that relationship with you and put their trust and their faith in you. Lord, I lift this prayer up to you in the name that's above every name, the name of Jesus. Amen.